Welcome to the Red Sneaker Podcast, your guide to success in the worlds of writing and publishing. Now, here's your host, best-selling author and founder of the Red Sneaker Writers Center, William Bernhardt.
Hello, Red Sneaker Writers. This is episode 23 going out on July 15, 2019. This podcast is for Red Sneaker writers, people who are serious about having a writing career and want some practical knowledge to help them do it. My very special guest interview for this episode is my dear friend John Wooley, who's probably best known as a horror writer, but this guy has written everything there is to write, all across the genres, fiction and nonfiction, having spent more than 40 years as a professional writer. He is the perfect guest for this episode when we're going to be talking a lot about genre mashups and crossovers and how these categories are changing. We'll get into the interview later on, but first, the news. This time, I'm going to combine both the writing tips and the news sections of the podcast to illustrate how not only books and book buying are changing, but the content of books is changing as well. Jeff Bezos famously said that it's day one of the digital revolution, and he's right, even though technically that began in 2009 and it's 10 years later, we're just starting to feel its impact, which seems to grow exponentially year after year. Of course, people are reading differently, sometimes in digital forms on tablets and phones and whatnot. The way people are buying books has changed, but the content of those books themselves has also changed. So I want to use some of the recent breakthrough hits, some of the success stories in the publishing world to illustrate how these genres are changing, which shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. Everything's changing, right? Used to be when people wanted to know about your book, well, what is it? What kind of book is? They would want you to give it a 1 or 2 word genre classification. I do this sometimes in my writing retreats to help people focus on what it is they're writing. So I used to ask, well, what shelf would it be on at Barnes & Noble? Help them to not only categorize, but perhaps subcategorize what they're writing. Or if they don't go book shopping, what part of the library is it going to be in? What's its Dewey Decimal classification? Today, of course, more than 50% of all books sold in the United States are sold at Amazon. And so those Amazon categories, often very detailed categories and then subcategories and then subcategories, but those can be very important. Which ones you choose or are chosen for your book can be key to that book's exposure. People go through an enormous amount of strategizing every time they post a new book, thinking, well, do I want to pick the categories, subcategories, some obscure minor niche? Do I want to pick some big thing? Do I want to go for the most exposure or the most specific niche? Because then it will target people who just like that niche. Sometimes marketers will go for some obscure category that, nobody's ever heard of before, but there's less competition, so your book might be able to rise to number 1 on the list and get one of those number 1 bestseller flags. Lots of different approaches. But what's keen to me looking at this, and what I really think is kind of wonderful, is the way the internet, and to some extent Amazon, has made it possible for people to target specific interests, specific niches, like the ones that Jennifer Barnes talked about on her interview on a prior podcast when she was talking about the id list and how people like certain kinds of books, sometimes very specific, detailed, niche kind of books. Well, if that's what you like and that's what you're writing, you have a greater ability now to find those people. Let's talk about a couple of specific genres, starting with the romance genre, which, as you probably know, is by far the most popular and successful genre out there, usually said to be about 46-47% of all popular fiction. According to the Pew Research Center, 23% of all novels published overall, the complete fiction market, 23% of those are romance novels. Now, I don't know what was conjured up in your mind when I said the phrase romance novels, but depending upon your age, And gender, it might be very different. If you're my age or older, you may have been thinking about, Fabio covers and women with wasp waists, waspish white girl waists and nursing mother bodices. Well, you've got a whole different kind of picture in the romance world today. Sure, you still see the meet cute, the overwhelming complications that they still manage to overcome by the end of the book, because there must be a happy ending. But within those genre requirements, or conventions might be a better word, there's a lot of interesting stuff going on, particularly in the past couple years. Romance books, romantic comedies, really, in many cases, are more diverse and more complex and a lot sexier in a real and honest way than they perhaps have been in the past. Some people have attributed the change in the romance market to a book by Jasmine Guillory called The Wedding Date, which was published by Berkeley in January of last year, 2018. The author alone should give you a tip that this is going to be something different. Guillory is African American. She's a lawyer. She was educated at Stanford. And although the book features an interracial couple, that's not the main problem in the book. That's not what the book is about. Of course, there's conflict. There's always conflict in a novel, but the conflicts have more to do with the fact that they're leading separate lives that somehow have to be combined, not people approving or disapproving of their coupling because of the race involved. That was a change of pace, and she's built on that in subsequent books like The Proposal, which became a Reese's Book Club selection. That, of course, is Reese Witherspoon, who's sort of filling the gap that Oprah left behind by making book club selections that a lot of people are following. This has led to a whole line of romance novels that are more interesting, that have characters that are more diverse in many different ways, and an approach to sex which acknowledges that this can be pleasurable for people without them having to be embarrassed or slut-shamed or anything like that. It's a normal part of life. People are responding to this, of course, in a great way. Romance is always popular, appear to be becoming even more popular. Is this something you, Red Sneaker writer, want to tap into? Well, if you don't read romances, then the answer is no. Don't attempt to write a genre you don't know anything about. Don't say, oh, that's easy, they just have to meet cute and blah, blah, blah. Then you're being condescending and your book's going to fail. If you read it, if you like it, then you might be able to put together something that actually works. And that might be something worthwhile thinking about if you fit in that category, because here's some more statistics from Pew Research Center, the Pew Research Center. Romance readers simply read more than the average American does. That's one of the reasons why the romance novels take up such a huge percentage of the overall market. On average, according to Pew, Americans read about 4 books a year, on average. But romance readers read 1 book a week, on average. Yes, you heard that right. 1 book a week. Obviously, there's a market there and maybe room for 1 more person. Could that be you? Well, what if you're not a romance kind of person? What if you go in more for thrillers or perhaps even darker stuff like horror? We're also seeing now a crossover of the elements of horror being used in novels that aren't specifically considered horror novels. In some cases, even novels that are considered literary fiction. The serious stuff that academics write about and New York Times book reviews review, but there are horror elements in it. A recent book comes from Helen Phillips, a book called The Need, not her first dark novel or first book to have horror elements, but she is considered a serious literary author. She's not the only one to have done this. Take a look at Little Darlings by Melanie Golding or Orange World by Karen Russell. All of these are literary fiction, but with strong elements of horror. Specifically, The Need and others are part of what seems to be a growing surge in books that deal with, that use horror tropes to capture all of the pain and suffering and panic and self-doubt that new parents, particularly mothers, often face. Although, as a father, I've got to say there's, some panic on all sides. But most of these books are featuring female protagonists talking about how tired you get up, waking up in the middle of the night, exhaustion that at some point seems to induce hallucination, or the feeling that there are endless chores, monotonous chores, things doing over and over again, the highs, the lows, and people are using that by giving it a horror spin, combining, ideally, a literary novel that isn't boring, that still has some of the engagement and excitement of a horror novel, or if you want to look at the flip side, a horror novel that still showcases some of the best writing imaginable. All of these, to me, are signs that the book world is changing, and I hope getting a little bit less rigid. Instead of authors having to be put in a pigeonhole, this is a serious writer, this is a popular writer, understanding that there are elements of the best of both worlds in all of the best fiction, and perhaps we should be judging books based upon the qualities within rather than what classification someone has put on it. What I would encourage all of you to do is to think originally. Think beyond the borders. Don't let yourself limited. What's the best book you could come in up with? Can I take elements from over here and move them over there and mash up some things, write it really well, write and rewrite and perfect, and come up with something wonderful that might be the best way to break out in today's world? And books that might have had a challenge finding an audience might be more able to do so today because of the more flexible categorization in the online market. One last story I wanted to talk to you about, and this involves an author named Mark Zerbo. He's an author of several books. He's written for adults. He's written for children. But this year, he has made a pledge, thinking of his daughter, who he clearly adores. Her name is Cielo, which is heaven in Spanish. And she's golden hair and extroverted. And he obviously loves this girl very much. And so as his gift to her, he is committed to writing a children's story a day for the entire year. That's 365 days, one per year, and not just blowing it off with a couple of sentences, but writing a full-blown story every day as a tribute to his daughter. As he said in an interview in the New York Times, he's really writing them for her, but, if a few of them catch the attention of a publisher who's interested, that's okay with him too. And so far, he's about 260 stories deep into this. And it's not even, I could conceive of doing something like that if I were just sitting around at home and had nothing else to do. But he's out traveling across the world, going on adventures in Australia and whatnot. And then in the evening sits down and writes his story a day, which is pretty impressive. What's the takeaway for you, Red Sneaker writers? Am I going to suggest that you start writing a story a day? No. I think that might be pushing it a little bit, and I think the best stories require a little bit more germination before they are perfect. But writing every day, now that's a wonderful idea. Writing 365 days a year, even if you don't get a complete story every day, maybe you just a chapter. But have you ever thought about what you could achieve if you committed to a schedule, a writing schedule that regular? I mean, think about it. Even if you just wrote, say you wrote 10 pages a day, you could finish the first draft of a novel in less than 2 months. And even if you missed a day, it wouldn't be the end of the world as long as you got right back on it. And then you would have lots of time to revise and fix the problems, perfect, send it out to beta readers, get input back. There's no telling what you could achieve as a writer if you just make yourself write every day. That's why I put